Welcome to part 2 of Windows and Solar Control, where we're discussing various different methods for managing solar gain through Windows in OpenStudio. The first part covered transmission of solar radiation through one zone and into another, as well as the application of space shades, also known as shading devices attached to the building. This one we're going to be covering screens, blinds, and shades in the form of curtains or roller shades or something of that nature. So there are a number of ways we can apply these and also control them. I'm going to be showing you two different methods of setting them up. First of all, if we take this zone here, which I have highlighted, we're going to put an internal blind on that zone. On the next zone, we're going to put an external blind. This one, we're going to do an internal shade. Here, an external shade. And then a screen on this one. So let's get started with that. To do so, to use the method from the SketchUp plugin to set these up, I'm going to go to Extensions, OpenStudio User Scripts, Add or Alter Model Elements, and Add Shading Controls. And a shading control is the actual control element of this. It's the control regime. It's not the actual shade or blind itself. It's the method that it's used, that it's managed by. So we don't have a shading material in here yet. This space we were going to add a blind to, so I'm going to go ahead and choose new blind as well, and it will create that blind. And we're not doing anything, we're not doing switchable glazing here, so I'm going to say no to that. Click OK. So I've got it in there now. If I come over to my inspector, I should be able to see that I've got shading control in here as expected, and its type is interior blind. We're going to talk about some of these others from OpenStudio itself, but notice here that it has window material blind 1 specified as the material that's being used. So it created that for us as well from that extension. Now, currently that's just a definition. I need to actually apply it to a window. So I'm going to do that through another script. So I'm going to go to Extensions, User Scripts, Add or Alter Model Elements, and come down to Set Shading Controls. And note that I already have my zone selected. So I'm going to set Shading Control 1 and apply it to that zone. And now we should have that attached to the window. Let's see, I'm not sure if we can see it when we look here, but let's go over and select the window and look in our inspector. And yes, indeed, we can see that now it's shading control 1 has been applied to that window. I could just select the window directly and apply it. So if I had multiple windows in a zone and the shading control only went with one of them, I would just select the one window I was interested in. All right, let's set up our second exterior blind here. So I'm going to select my next zone, which is blind exterior. I'm going to go to Extensions, User Scripts, Add or Alter Elements, Add Shading Controls again, and again I'm going to create a new blind. And say OK. Let's go look in the inspector. Now I've got two shading controls shown, so I've got 1 and 2. And now looking at shading control 2, it also says this is an interior blind. I'm going to change that to exterior blind. So it's worth talking about what a blind is. A blind is a louvered element, so a Venetian blind or a vertical blind where you have slats that are lined up. Those slats can either be operable or fixed. There are various different ways of controlling those, and they can either be vertical or horizontal, and you can control many different parameters around those, which we'll look at here in just a moment. All right, so I've changed that to exterior blind. It's created window material blind 2. for us here. I'm going to come in, this time I'll just select the one window. Under extensions, I'm now needing to apply that shading control to this window, so I'm going to choose set shading controls, and it already defaulted to control 2, so I'm going to say OK. And now that window has shading control 2 applied to it. So I'm going to save my model, and we'll apply the rest of these within OpenStudio itself. So that was method 1 for applying these controls and materials. Let's go look at them in OpenStudio. First need to open my model. Running a little bit slow, letting me select this. Let's open it. So first off, let's go have a look at the materials we created. So if I come under Constructions, Materials, Blind Window Materials, and see here they are, Blind Window Material Blind 1 and Window Material Blind 2. I'm just going to go ahead and rename these so they're a little bit more concise and I can remember which one's which. We'll just call it this was my interior one, so I'm going to say that one's interior, and so this one is exterior. So there's this wide array of settings that we can control here on the blind. At the top, you choose whether it's horizontal or vertical. I'm going to stick with a horizontal blind. The slat width is the width of the actual louver itself, which is pretty typical by default of a interior mini blind. You can control the separation, the thickness of the slats themselves, their default angle. There's a wide array of factors. The input-output reference guide has detailed descriptions of what all of these parameters are about, and I've got a link to that in the class manual. In particular, I want to draw your attention to a couple down here at the bottom, which control the separation between the frame of the window and the blind itself. So you can see here you set the blind to glass distance here. This is the distance from the center of the blind to the face of the glass. And then there's this variety of opening multipliers, top, bottom, and the sides. At a default of 0.5 for blinds, this will result in a gap between the blind and the perimeter of the window equal to half the distance between the blind and the glass. And there's a detailed description of what these values mean also in the input-output reference guide. A value of 0 would mean no gap at all, and a value of 1 would mean a distance of that gap that was equal to the distance from the blind to the glass. So for my exterior blind, these are typically quite a bit larger. I'm going to keep it in a horizontal orientation. I'm going to make my slat width about 2.5 inches and the separation about 2 inches. I think the slats would likely be about, say those are about 1/4 inch thick. I'll stick with my default slat angle again, and the defaults again on the rest of it. Okay, so let's look at the controls. To do that, we want to come down to Spaces. I'm going to click here. We'll take just a moment to open that up. We can see it already opened up to Subsurfaces. I want to be on the Subsurfaces tab here. And I'm going to click over to Shading Controls. And so this is going to show me all the shading controls on all the subsurfaces in the model. and we can see Control 1 and Control 2 that we put in within the SketchUp plugin. So I'm going to click on Control 1, and it's got the shading type defined as interior blind, and I can see my shading device material name is now blind material internal. I don't have a construction with shading name, and I don't want to here. That's another method of defining these things, suitable for a different discussion. The one I'm recommending that you use is the one where we apply the shading device material to the window construction that's already defined as the construction of that window, and then control it as we decide to here. So shading control type is the primary method we use to control how the blind is operated. There are a number of ways we can do that. Here I'm going to go ahead and stick with the default, which was on if high solar on window. And then I can also add, in addition to that, a schedule that will control when the blind is allowed to operate. So in this case, if we have one of these other control types selected other than on if schedule allows, then the schedule acts as an availability schedule. If I just choose on if schedule allows, that's going to be when the blind itself is operated strictly according to the schedule, and then always on and always off operate in the way that you would expect. Again, the input-output reference guide has detailed descriptions of how all of these different control regimes work, and there's a link to it in the class reference manual. Some of these, like on if high solar on window, also then require a set point, or at least allow you to input a set point. I'm not sure what the default is on these. I believe there is one. But I'm going to input a default of, let's say, 200 watts per square meter. So the units for this set point are going to be in the SI system based on what would be expected for this input type. So some have to do with temperature, some have to do with solar insolation, and so on. And I'm going to allow it to operate at any time, so I'm not putting in a schedule. Telling it that the shading control is not specifically scheduled, and I'm going to leave it on fixed slat angle. I can also adjust the slat angle to adjust itself to block beam solar radiation if it can, or put it on a schedule of when those slats are at what angle. All right, let's look at my second shading control. So now this is for my exterior blind. It's noting, okay, it's an exterior blind. And let's, again, I've got my exterior blind material specified here, and I'm going to set this one based on a schedule. And I'm going to apply a schedule that I made here with a value of 1 during the day and 0 at night, which means on during the day and off at night. And I believe daytime went from 8 a.m. to about 6 p.m., this schedule. All right, so those should be set up and ready to go. Now, I still have a few more zones to set up here. I'm going to set those up directly from OpenStudio. So my next one was for some shades. I'm going to go back to my materials again, save my model, and create my shade window materials. I'm going to click down on shade window material, add in a new material. I'm going to call this one shade internal. And a shade can be anything from a curtain to a blind as in a like a roller shade, a sheer, anything like that. And they don't necessarily have to be fabric. We have all the physical properties to define it as whatever material that you want it to be. It's essentially a continuous sheet of some material that's going to be in front of the window when you put it there with the properties you define. So for my internal shade, let's assume that this is pretty close to opaque. I'm going to say its transmittance is about 5%. Keep some of the defaults on these others, but make it 5% on both the visible and solar. And its thickness, this is fairly thick. I can adjust the conductivity if I want a really insulating material in here to act as movable insulation on windows, for example. I can set these values appropriately to reflect that as well. Again, you want to pay attention to the shade to glass distance, and as well as these opening multipliers that function the same way we described on blinds. In this case, it's assuming that there's no gap between the shade and the perimeter of the window. So there's not going to be much airflow. In fact, there's going to be zero airflow because it's also assumed a zero airflow permeability through the shade itself. So this is essentially sealing around the window. I'm going to increase this a little bit. I'm going to say this is about, say that's about 10%, just for the sake of argument. Okay, create my other shade. And so for this one, for the sake of the example, I'm going to accept all the defaults on that. So this will be my exterior one. Let's go back to my spaces, subsurfaces, shading controls. Now that's going on space 6 and 7, so I've got window 6 and 7 as well. Now I need to create new shading controls for this because I didn't create those in the SketchUp plugin, so I'm going to go to my library. Down at the very bottom is the shading control object. I'm going to bring in shading control. Just a second to catch up. Click on my shading control. Now for some reason, when you bring in this object from OpenStudio, it seems to not let you access all of the various options down here, and I'm not sure why that happens. It does depend partially on the settings you use. Let's see what happens as I edit this. So this one is going to be actually an interior shade, and my material is going to be shade internal as well. And then I can also set the shading control type out here, as well as the schedule name. So for this one, I am going to, let's say this one is, let's just say this one is always on. Which we don't need a schedule for. And then for our exterior shade, again, I'm going to bring in my shading control object. Set it to exterior shade. Let's set this one based on the zone air temperature. I can see it's opened up set point now, and let's say if the interior temperature goes above 20 degrees Celsius, then we're going to apply that exterior shade. All right, lastly, we're going to do a screen. Come back over to materials again. Select my screen window material, add that in. Now this is going to be something equivalent to an insect screen or a larger grid of any type. It models it as though it's a cylindrical tube grid. And we have a variety of settings we can use here, again, to control not only the way the solar is handled, but also things like conductivity, the solar transmission, so it could be something like a solar screen, the material of the wires itself, as well as the openings and glass distance and so forth. Now screens can only be external to the window. So I'm going to name it screen. Again, I'll go back to my spaces, subsurfaces, shade controls. Let's put in a shading control for this one as well. Note that only exterior is available for screen. Make sure that I've got the proper material selected, which was screen. I'm going to double check on these if I had the right one selected. So I had my internal shade on that one. Oh, I didn't on this one. This was supposed to be the exterior screen, so I'm glad I went back and checked. So I need to, sorry, the exterior shade rather. So I need to go choose my shade exterior material there. Got it right on that one, and then this one we've got our screen. And let's set this one to be controlled, or really not controlled. It's always going to be on because we're assuming it's a fixed insect screen or something of that nature. All right, I'm going to save my file. I'm ready to run my simulation. Set that running and break for a moment while the simulation completes. Okay, my run is completed and I've opened up the SQL file in dview, and I'd like to study the zone window's total transmitted solar radiation rate in this instance. So first I'm going to go ahead and plot again my control zone, zone 1 here, and then let's remind ourselves how these various different shade conditions were set up. So let's look at the blinds first. So on the interior blind, we were controlling it based on high solar on the window, and we set a set point of 200 watts a square meter for that set point. So it's going to deploy those interior blinds whenever insolation on the window exceeds 200 watts per square meter. For the exterior blind, we said we're going to schedule it, and it's going to be deployed 100% during the day and not at all at nighttime. So let's look at those again in dview here. So that is going to be my internal blind. Let's look at that first. This was the one that was controlled based on solar. So we can see it's really cutting down on the amount of solar gain. At this time of year here, we can see that solar gain goes up to a certain point. It starts to exceed 200 watts a square meter value. Here we've got, because of the time steps, it's overshooting it for one time step, so it applies the blind at the next time step, and then drops down, keeps it well below that. We're still getting some solar gain because it's coming in through the window, in spite of the fact that the blind is there on the inside. So we still have some solar gain even when that blind is deployed. Let's look how that compares to the exterior blind. Turn that one off. And we can see then that remains consistently low throughout the day. And let's look at this over the course of the year, as well as throughout the course of the year, because it's deploying that blind every single day on the schedule that we've set. So it comes on in the morning and drops in the afternoon. We're still getting some solar gain because there is radiation that's reflected off the slats of the blind that are coming in through the window, and there's some gaps in there. It's not actually adjusting the angle of those slats. So there may be some times at which there's some direct sun coming in as well. But it'd be very little, and it would just be like small swaths of direct sun coming in through there. So pretty consistent throughout the year. The reduction in solar gain is going to be indicative of the reduced insolation at those times of year. So if we look at those together, the internal and external blind, we can see they end up having some pretty substantially different effects at the edges of their operation, but at the moment when that internal blind is deployed, it ends up bringing the values pretty close in line with what's happening with an external blind. So both not optimized, but fairly effective strategies, and we can really see clearly the model is doing something along the lines of what we expect here, because there's some substantial differences between our control zone and those two test zones. Let's look at our shade. So starting with our interior shade, let's look at that. The interior shade, we had always on, meaning it's always deployed, and this material that we set up, our internal shade material, was near opaque. I believe it had about 10% light and solar transmittance. Our exterior shade is going to be deployed based on the zone air temperature whenever that zone air temperature exceeds 20 degrees Celsius. So our interior blind, much as we would expect, it's radically cutting down on solar gain throughout the transmitted solar radiation throughout the course of the year, but there is still some transmission because of that translucency of the blind. Our external shade, let's turn that one on. Now, because this was based on air temperature, it's having a much different kind of effect, not as dramatic as the other one, but we can see it's definitely having some impact here. Now, lastly, we had our screen. That was being deployed uniformly because we assumed it was an insect screen that stays on the window throughout the course of the year. So we can see that effect that it has at all times. And the rate of transmittance should be proportional to the control zone at all those times. So if we turn all those on at once, zoom in, we can see really the considerable variety of performance characteristics that we created there. So there is a lot you can do and study with these tools. They don't only affect solar gain, they also affect heating and cooling loads, both directly in terms of the amount of solar gain that's created, and also indirectly in terms of affecting the heat loss and heat gain through the envelope, because these are modeled as having a conductance as well that you can control, and so they've got some insulating value as well.